there, and welcome to the GITEX Tech Waves podcast. Lovely to have you listening, lovely to have you watching, and we are, of course, bringing you the latest trends and innovations in the shifting tides of tech. And I'm delighted to say that today we're actually broadcasting live from our on-site studio in Dubai World Trade Center. We're in the midst of the GITEX Global Show right now. I'm Georgia Tolley, and I'm delighted to have been meeting so many people for this GITEX Tech Waves podcast. Of course, we are in the midst of the biggest tech show in the world. Now, in this episode, we're going to be speaking to a senior expert from the world of artificial intelligence, a pioneering AI company launched by Abu Dhabi's Advanced Technology Research Council and Venture One. Now, Mehdi Ghissassi is our AI expert for the day, and I'm delighted to say he joins me here in the studio to discuss the latest advances. Thank you for joining us for the GITEX Tech Waves podcast. It's lovely to have you with us.
Thank you, Georgia. My pleasure.
It's good to have you with us because it's really fascinating stuff hearing how Abu Dhabi is sort of getting involved in this field. And it is such a broad field, a broad church. I know that especially people in the media like myself tend to use AI as a catch-all phrase. And I'm slightly embarrassed to ask you this question, but I'm going to go with it anyway. Because I'd like to get an overview of how you see artificial intelligence driving the next wave of technological transformations across all industries. I mean, it's about as broad brushstroke a question as I could ask, but you can take it where you wish.
Yeah, it's a great one actually to start with. AI is probably the most exciting scientific endeavor of the moment, right? And the one way to understand it is that we humans have been teaching computers to do things for us. In the past decade, we taught them to, for example, understand images. Is this a cat? Is this a dog? And that led to tools for clinicians to help them understand scans, right? And offload them from that parts of that work. In the very, very short past, right, as in the next 3-4 years perhaps, we moved into this generative AI phase where now computers, we've been teaching them to do more and more cognitive tasks. And so you can have a conversation, right, with the computer and you don't know if it's a computer or not. You can ask it to synthesize a book and it actually makes sense what it's telling you, right? So that's what AI is and how you can understand it. And the impact that it might have and is having currently, and we see the premise of that in very, very different fields, is that we're equipping humans with intelligent tools that help them do things, offload things from them so that they can focus on other parts of their jobs or their lives.
Here in the UAE, we have this large language model, which is called Falcon, appropriately. What stage have you now reached with that LLM?
Yes, so TII, the Technology Innovation Institute, was at the forefront of the generative AI revolution, right? Like more than 2-3 years ago, one of the first LLMs that was actually developed and was topping the chart was the first Falcon, right? And so the team has continued progressing on this journey of pushing the advances of AI coming out of the region and being up there competing with the best players on the field and also innovating with new ways of addressing this topic. As an example, just a few weeks ago, we launched a Mamba model, which is a different architecture of models, right? Like most of the large labs have been pushing on the transformers architecture, which gave incredible progress to the world. We are not only advancing that one, but also trying out other architectures that can open up other fields in the AI race.
How strategically important is it for a country to have its own large language model?
I think beyond large language models or AI, right? Like it's incredibly important for the world to invest in R&D. And so it's incredibly important for countries if they want to have a brighter future to invest in R&D. And as I was saying earlier, AI is probably the most incredible scientific endeavor of the time that we have. And so I find it normal for the UAE to contribute to this human endeavor its part and to advance the state of research in AI.
So I've done quite a lot of interviews with experts on the subject of artificial intelligence, and Falcon is regularly cited as an impressive LLM. It's perceived very positively around the world. That must, improve the UAE's standing, I suppose, within the scientific community.
Yeah, probably. I think scientists want to work with the best people. They want to be in an environment where they have access to resources, like-minded people, and are able to experiment and push the state of the art in their fields. And so it can only be positive that more and more people move here to the UAE, to Abu Dhabi, to TII, and get to work and advance their research in the field. It's also good for the region to be able to contribute to humanity's quest for knowledge and understanding. Beyond that, in the AI field, there's an incredibly important piece, which is data, right? Like your models are as good as the data that you put into them, and also the data reflects societal preferences, specificities of areas. And so by being able to contribute data from this part of the world, be it language, cultural references, etc., you can also push to be represented in the global discourse around AI.
I'm interested by language, which you mentioned us there. So much of the internet, I mean, maybe it's just because I only read English, but so much of the internet seems to be in English. Is it a fact that AI is or these large language models are at risk of being monolingual, or am I missing the point? Is it because if it's AI, it can just translate it in a drop of a hat?
You are right, but there is also another perspective, right? Like in the sense that if you're only using language content that is in one language, English, then that content also comes with a certain view of the world, some history of the world, right? So you could translate that, but you'd only be translating that
words.
Side of it, right? So it's important to also take into account the other languages that are there. Some are, as you said, like underrepresented in the amount of information that's available online that these LLMs are trained on. And so from my perspective, it can only be positive to add to the mix of data. Perhaps there are different patterns in different types of data and languages that will make the whole way better.
So at the moment, Falcon is open source. Why is that important, and do you see it remaining open source?
Yeah, since the early days, TII has been incredibly a huge supporter of the open source movement. And one of the reasons is that research has benefited from being open source, right? Because that's how you can publish and then get others to look at the work that you're doing, to suggest other ideas, to also build on top of it. And so far, this is the approach that the organization has taken to keep pushing the research agenda in this field.
Do you think other LLM companies will continue with their open source policies as well? Do you think in the next 5 years we could see a switch around, potentially in the States, for example?
Yeah, it's a great question. OpenAI started as open, right? Today, some people mentioned that it should maybe change its name to closed. But
I'm so pleased you touched on them, because that was exactly who I was talking about. So I appreciate you mentioning OpenAI specifically. And clearly some people within that company have struggled with that shift as well. We've seen a lot of ructions within the senior management at the company. So it's clearly potentially quite a controversial subject.
It is true that a lot of the labs that are at the forefront of this revolution are research labs, and researchers have this culture of publishing, right? So that not only their work is recognized, but also they can contribute, get feedback, and keep improving their work. Different companies have picked different approaches to this question of open source versus closed. Now, what we're seeing is that the open source is catching up to the closed source, to the closed models, right? There are all these graphs that show you that, at every generation, the gap is getting smaller. So it is very possible that we keep saying different players take different strategies based on their own goals and interests, which make total sense. So I don't think everybody has to be open source, but the open source space is doing incredibly well.
If your company is open source, is there not a risk that that's opening it to potential, I don't know, threats, potential ethical issues?
So exactly. Some folks argue that you should close these models because they could be so dangerous that you don't want them in the wrong hands. Other people argue the other side of this, which is actually by opening them to everybody, you can see the vulnerabilities and then fix them, right? So from my perspective, I think that both approaches are helpful, and that the important bit is to be able to have a global discourse on this and to invite people from different sides of the topic. So be it researchers, ethicists, engineers, policy folks, to have a debate as the ones that are happening at government levels. There was the London Summit, there's the Paris Summit soon, and the Seoul one. So I think these conversations are happening, and a number of institutes are being put out there to check the vulnerabilities in models and help the development of AI in a very responsible and thoughtful way.
So as a tech journalist, rather than a sort of tech analyst or I don't know, technological genius, for example, from the outside, we can already see this exciting sort of interface with the large language models. It is amazing to be able to almost have a conversation with what is essentially a bot, or it's exciting that they can rewrite poems in the style of Chaucer or Mick Jagger, whatever. You can play with it and you can ask it questions. How soon do you think that's going to take the next step? How soon are we all going to have a personal AI assistant? Or am I already not thinking far enough? Is there going to be another leap almost immediately after that?
You're touching on a really, really important point that people in the industry call emerging capabilities, right? Which is sometimes the folks who build these models realize once they've built them that they do things that they didn't expect them to do, as in they picked up a new language, or as you said, you're able to have a conversation with them and feel like it's human, or they are able to draw pictures in the style of this or that. And so, the rate of progress, and the beauty of it actually in research is that the rate of progress is non-linear, right? Like you discover things after doing a lot of work, but you don't predict the day or the time that you're going to discover this, right? So it is very likely that we will keep on benefiting from all this research and find new properties that these models will show, but we can't really predict when. Now, a lot of people have been talking about AGI, right? Which are these algorithms that are superhuman. Different people have different ways of defining this, right? But one is that you could have an agent that has human capabilities on a lot of tasks, and people have been adjusting their views on when will that happen, and many of the luminaries of the space think that it's in the next decade. We're already seeing premises of this, right? Where you've seen that just last week, 2 Nobel Prizes were given to former colleagues of mine in the previous teams that I've been in, and it's pretty incredible to see the rate of progress and the new knowledge that we humans are able to get through these technologies, right? So we can only be incredibly excited about what the future holds as we invest in research and push these technologies forward in a responsible way.
I'm glad you mentioned the responsible way, because there have been some of the luminaries from your own industry who have expressed quite strong concerns about the direction of travel. Sam Altman does them, but then carries on with them. And in my view, Elon Musk has mentioned there are serious issues, but then carries on with creating an AI company. Do you feel any fear about the way that artificial intelligence is developing? It's a very emotive word.
Yeah, it is. Different people will react differently, right? To that word. I don't fear where it's going, because ultimately, in one view, you can just unplug all this and then it's okay, right? Just as when my mom didn't know how to turn off the TV, so she would just unplug it. I think we can do something a bit similar. Now, that doesn't mean that we can let everything happen without looking at it deeply and thoughtfully, right? You can think of applications in domains like biotechnologies, where now we can design new proteins. Well, proteins can be good for you, they can also be bad for you. there are a lot of parallels with nuclear power, right? Like that similarly can help solve many issues we have, like climate change, but on the other hand, can be used to develop weapons that can wipe out humanity, right? So from my perspective, I believe that we need a balanced approach that puts into the mix perspectives from different people. And so I'm incredibly happy that different regions of the world are contributing to research and development in this field, that different institutes are looking at the policy implications and the ethical implications of this. And through these debates and exchanges, we would probably get to a better place.
I mean, ultimately, much of this is still in the R&D phase, but there is going to come a time where it's, enters the business space. When it enters the business world, it's commercialized and it's changing all of our lives on a day-to-day basis. That's the point where everyone thinks they're going to lose their job. I'd love to get your insights on where you see that going, how soon you feel it's going to start impacting on our day-to-day life.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a debate that's continuous, right? Like it's humanity and technology. Like over time, we've been incredibly good at building tools that help us do things. And then we wonder about what do we do, right? Like back in the days, to calculate something, you had humans doing the calculations. Then we invented the calculator, and we need those guys to keep calculating, but they moved on to do other things, right? The Luddites had the same issue, right? Like in the UK, in the industrial revolutions, where they ended up destroying the machines, etc., because they thought they would lose their jobs. I'm optimistic by nature, so I am pretty convinced that humans will find new things to do. The reality is we're providing people with more intelligence that they can use to help them do more things, to help them in their tasks, in their day-to-day jobs, in their lives. Think of when we traveled before without Google Maps, right? Like we used to need a map and look for directions, ask people. Maybe you didn't speak the language, so it was complicated. Now you go to places, you don't speak the language, they don't speak your language, and you can still communicate and find your way and see things. So my perspective is more optimistic than pessimistic on this topic. Though we still have to accompany the change, right? Like because change comes, and so there's a period where you have to re-educate, retrain, help people find these new roles and adopt the new technologies. And so, yeah, in the next few years, we're already seeing these tools being used here and there, right? Like medical practice is full of these examples where now you have clinical decision-making tools, you have alerting systems that tell doctors things about their patients. They've learned how to include them into their workflows, and they're doing better with it. They limit administrative burden, they can spend more time with their patients, while before they couldn't. So yeah, it will definitely happen, as you mentioned, but people will have other things to do. They will think about what to do and figure out where to deploy their energies.
So my final question, I want to talk about guardrails, because you mentioned there the London summit, there's going to be a Paris one. Yeah. Who do you think should be creating those guardrails? Do you think it should be governments? Do you think it should be the United Nations? Or do you think that the commercial entities can be trusted to introduce their own guardrails? After all, they're the people who understand the most what's going on.
It's a complicated topic because we live in a world where people are experts of given topics, but the impact of anything touches way more topics than anyone is an expert in at, right? Like AI is a horizontal technology, but its application comes in multiple verticals. And so I can be developing a technology that then is going to be used in the financial industry, but I don't know much about that space, right? I could be developing it in this part of the world, and it might have an impact in another part of the world, right? And so I think that it requires a global convening of experts of the different domains, and for them to be able to understand the perspective of others so that they can think through not only how to help the growth and development of this industry, but also not to destroy it while it is still moving, right? We already see differences between regions where the European Union, for example, decided to regulate, and so I have a lot of French friends who are complaining that they can't use the latest and greatest tools, while the moment they land in the US, they can actually do a ton of things. And so some of them are worried, to the point you made on the question before, that perhaps they will be left behind. And so to answer your question, I think it requires different disciplines, different organizations, and different parts of representatives of different parts of the world to come together in a collaborative way.
Mehdi Ghissassi, what an absolutely fascinating interview. Thank you very much indeed. I feel like we've done a very far-reaching interview there. I've learned a huge amount from it, and I couldn't appreciate your time more. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, really lovely to have you here on our GITEX Tech Waves podcast. Make sure for more interviews like that, you stay tuned to our social media at GITEX Global to find out more. Also, all of those future announcements can be found there. But thank you very much indeed for listening, and thank you, sir.
Of course. Thank you so much. Pleasure.